Sometimes the earth holds secrets that can transform a broken man's destiny in ways he never imagined possible. When Jake Sullivan lost his job at the automotive plant, he thought rock bottom had a basement. Now he's staring at a crumbling wooden shack in the middle of nowhere, Texas, inherited from a great uncle he barely remembered. Everyone in Millbrook thinks he's lost his mind for even considering the ramshackle property worth his time. But beneath that worthless piece of land lies something that will turn a desperate father's world upside down and prove that sometimes the greatest fortunes come disguised as the most hopeless situations. What happens when a man with nothing left to lose discovers that his family's forgotten legacy holds the key to a $350 million oil reserve that could change not just his life, but the entire future of his small town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the unemployment office cast a sickly yellow glow across Jake Sullivan's weathered hands as he signed yet another stack of rejection letters. At 34, he carried the exhausted posture of a man who had been fighting an uphill battle for months, ever since Millbrook Automotive announced they were moving operations to Mexico and laying off their entire workforce. His dark brown hair, once meticulously styled for work, now hung unkempt across a face that showed the strain of sleepless nights spent calculating bills against a dwindling bank account. The small town of Millbrook, Texas, had been built around three things: oil, cattle, and the automotive plant. With oil prices fluctuating wildly and the plant gone, the town felt like it was slowly dying, taking Jake's hopes along with it. "Daddy, did you find a job today?" The question came from Mia, his 7-year-old daughter, as she looked up from her coloring book at their kitchen table that evening. Her blonde pigtails bounced as she tilted her head, and her blue eyes held the kind of innocent trust that made Jake's chest tighten with guilt and determination in equal measure. The apartment they rented was small but clean, though Jake noticed how Mia had started rationing her crayons, making each one last as long as possible. She had her mother's gentle nature but had developed a carefulness around money that no child should have to think about. Since Rebecca's death in a car accident 2 years ago, it had been just the two of them against the world, and Jake was terrified he wasn't enough. "Still looking, sweetheart," Jake replied, forcing a smile as he helped her with her homework. "But something good is going to happen soon. I can feel it." The lie came easily because he had been telling it for weeks, but each time it felt heavier on his tongue. Their savings were nearly gone, the rent was overdue, and the stack of unpaid bills on his desk seemed to multiply every time he looked away. Rebecca's life insurance had covered her medical expenses and funeral costs, leaving them with just enough to survive for a while, but that while was rapidly approaching its end. The phone rang just as Jake was tucking Mia into bed, reading her favorite story about a little girl who discovered a magical garden. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but Jake answered anyway, hoping it might be about one of the dozens of job applications he had submitted. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Patricia Hendricks from the law firm of Hendricks & Associates in Austin. I'm calling about the estate of your great-uncle Ezra Whitman." Jake frowned, trying to place the name. "I'm sorry, I don't think I know anyone by that name." "Mr. Whitman was your grandmother's brother. He passed away 3 weeks ago, and according to his will, he's left you some property. I need you to come to Austin to discuss the details and sign some paperwork." The conversation felt surreal. Jake vaguely remembered his grandmother mentioning a brother who had moved to West Texas decades ago, but she had always spoken of him as the family's black sheep, someone who had chased wild dreams and never amounted to much. The idea that this forgotten relative had left him anything seemed impossible. "What kind of property?" Jake asked, already feeling the familiar disappointment that came with hope that was too good to be true. Patricia's voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered news that was rarely as good as people hoped. "It's a small parcel of land about 40 miles outside of Millbrook. 37 acres, mostly scrubland with an old structure. Nothing particularly valuable, I'm afraid. But it's yours if you want it. There are some back taxes owed, about $8,000. But you're not obligated to accept the inheritance if the financial burden isn't worth it." $8,000 might as well have been $8 million given Jake's current situation. He looked toward Mia's bedroom, where she slept surrounded by stuffed animals that had belonged to her mother, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on his shoulders. "Can I see the property before deciding?" "Of course." The address is 47,829 County Road 15, about 10 miles past the old Hendricks farm. I should warn you, Mr. Sullivan, the property has been abandoned for years. Your great-uncle was something of a recluse, and the local people considered him eccentric at best. After hanging up, Jake sat in his darkened living room, staring at the address he had written on the back of an envelope. 37 acres of Texas scrubland and an old shack, inherited from a great-uncle he had never met, with $8,000 in back taxes he couldn't afford to pay. It sounded like the punchline to a particularly cruel joke, but it was also the first unexpected thing that had happened to him in months. And Jake had learned that sometimes unexpected was better than hopeless, even if it came with complications he couldn't handle. The next morning, he loaded Mia into their aging pickup truck and drove the 40 miles to County Road 15, following Patricia's directions through increasingly remote stretches of Texas countryside. The landscape changed from the green pastures near Millbrook to the drier, rockier terrain that characterized this part of West Texas. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Mia asked, pressing her face against the window to watch the endless fences and oil pump jacks that dotted the horizon. "We're going to see some land that belonged to your great-great-uncle Ezra," Jake explained. "Someone you never met, but who was part of our family." The property was marked by a rusted mailbox leaning at a dangerous angle beside a cattle gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Jake had to get out and wrestle with the chain and padlock, which finally gave way with a screech of protest that echoed across the empty landscape. The dirt road that led to the house was barely visible, overgrown with mesquite and prickly pear cactus that scraped against the truck's paint as they bounced over ruts and potholes. After about half a mile, the road opened into a clearing where the most pathetic structure Jake had ever seen squatted like a wounded animal. Calling it a shack was generous. The building was maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, constructed of weathered wood that had faded to the color of old bones. The roof sagged in the middle, several windows were boarded up, and the front porch looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard near it. Weeds grew up through the floorboards, and Jake could see daylight through gaps in the siding. "It's kind of spooky," Mia observed with the matter-of-fact honesty that children brought to difficult situations. Jake had to agree. The place looked like it belonged in a horror movie rather than a family inheritance. But as they walked around the property, he found himself noticing details that suggested the land had once been carefully maintained. Old fence posts marked property boundaries with mathematical precision, and there were remnants of what might have been a garden near the back of the house. More intriguingly, there were several concrete pads scattered around the property, each one carefully leveled and reinforced, as if they'd... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Had been designed to support heavy equipment. Near the largest pad, Jake found a pile of rusted pipes and what looked like the remains of some kind of drilling apparatus. "Daddy, look at this," Mia called from near a cluster of mesquite trees about 100 yards from the house. She was standing beside a stone marker that had been placed with obvious deliberation, though weather had made most of the carved inscription illegible. Jake knelt beside the marker, brushing away decades of accumulated dirt and plant growth. The stone was granite, expensive and built to last, with craftsmanship that spoke to someone who had cared about permanence. He could make out what appeared to be coordinates and a date, 1987. As they explored further, Jake began to notice that the property's apparent abandonment was deceptive. Someone had invested serious time and money in infrastructure that went far beyond what would be needed for a simple homestead. There were concrete foundations for structures that had never been built, electrical conduits that led nowhere, and a water well that looked professionally drilled despite the property's remote location. The inside of the shack was even more surprising than the outside. While the structure itself was falling apart, the interior had been converted into something that looked more like a research center than a living space. One wall was covered with geological survey maps, each one marked with careful notations in a precise hand. Another wall held charts showing land ownership patterns and mineral rights data that went back decades. But it was the desk in the center of the room that made Jake's breath catch. Spread across the scarred wooden surface were documents that looked official and important. Geological reports, soil composition analyses, and what appeared to be correspondence with various oil exploration companies. Mia found a box of old photographs while Jake examined the papers. The pictures showed a man in his 70s, tall and lean with the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. In several photos, he stood beside serious-looking equipment, drilling rigs, survey instruments, and trucks loaded with scientific gear. "Is this Uncle Ezra?" Mia asked, holding up a photograph that showed the man standing beside a tall drilling rig with his hand resting proudly on the machinery. Jake studied the photo, noting the expression of determined confidence on Ezra Whitman's face. This wasn't a picture of a failed dreamer that his grandmother's stories had painted. This was a man who had been pursuing something specific with professional resources and serious commitment. One of the geological reports on the desk was dated just 6 months ago, suggesting that Ezra had been actively researching right up until his death. The report, from a company called Texas Deep Earth Analysis, concluded with a recommendation for additional exploratory drilling based on, quote, promising subsurface formations consistent with significant hydrocarbon deposits. Jake read the technical language slowly, not entirely understanding the scientific terminology, but grasping the basic conclusion. Someone with professional credentials believed there might be oil beneath this seemingly worthless piece of scrubland. But it was the handwritten note clipped to the report that made Jake's hands tremble as he read it. In the same careful script that had marked the survey maps, Ezra Whitman had written, 43 years of research confirms it. The Hendricks Field extends farther south than anyone realized. If Jake ever inherits this land, tell him to look beneath the stone marker near the mesquite grove. Everything he needs to know is there. The oil companies have been trying to lease this land for decades, but they don't know what I know. Trust no one until you understand what you're dealing with. Jake looked up from the note to find Mia staring at him with the kind of intense focus she usually reserved for particularly challenging math problems. "Daddy, you look like you saw a ghost." In a way, he had. Jake was seeing the ghost of a great uncle he had never known. A man who had spent 4 decades researching and preparing for something he apparently believed would change everything. The question was whether Ezra Whitman had been a visionary who had discovered something extraordinary, or just another dreamer who had convinced himself that his wild theories were facts. But as Jake looked around the shack, taking in the professional equipment, the detailed research, and the obvious investment of time and money, he found himself leaning toward the visionary theory. Men who were simply chasing fantasies didn't typically have correspondence with oil exploration companies or geological reports from legitimate scientific firms. The sun was setting by the time they finished exploring the property, casting long shadows across the scrubland that made the landscape look more mysterious than desolate. As they drove home, Mia fell asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted by their day of discovery and adventure. Jake's mind was racing with possibilities and questions in equal measure. He had inherited land that looked worthless, but might contain something valuable. He had discovered research that suggested his great-uncle had been far more sophisticated than family stories indicated. Most importantly, he had been given a puzzle that might lead to a solution for the financial problems that had been crushing his family for months. But he had also inherited $8,000 in back taxes, suspicious advice about trusting no one, and the responsibility of making decisions that could affect Mia's future in ways he couldn't predict. As they pulled into their apartment complex, Jake made a decision that would change everything that followed. Instead of dismissing Ezra Whitman's research as the delusions of a lonely old man, he would take it seriously. He would treat his great-uncle's 43 years of work as legitimate investigation rather than eccentric obsession. Tomorrow he would go back to the stone marker near the mesquite grove and find out what Ezra Whitman had wanted him to know. Tonight, he would study the geological reports and try to understand what his great-uncle had spent a lifetime trying to prove. For the first time in months, Jake Sullivan went to sleep with something other than despair weighing on his mind. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was possibility. And possibility felt like a gift he hadn't dared to expect. The metal box buried beneath the stone marker contained documents that made Jake question everything he thought he understood about his family's history and his own situation. Ezra Whitman's final message was written on letterhead from a geological consulting firm, dated just 2 weeks before his death, and addressed specifically to Jake with a formality that suggested his great-uncle had spent considerable time preparing for this moment. "Jake, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've inherited more than you realize," the letter began. "For 43 years, I've been researching and documenting what I believe to be one of the largest undiscovered oil deposits in Texas. The major oil companies have been trying to lease this land and the surrounding properties for decades, but they've been looking in the wrong places and using incomplete information. The letter went on to explain that Ezra had spent his career as a petroleum geologist before retiring to pursue independent research on land formations that the major companies had dismissed as unproductive. His analysis of soil samples, seismic data, and historical drilling records had convinced him that conventional wisdom about oil deposits in this region was wrong. The Hendricks Field that made several families rich in the 1970s extends much farther south than anyone realized. Ezra's letter continued. But the geological formation changes as it moves south, creating a different type of deposit that requires different extraction techniques. The major companies gave up too early because they were using the wrong approach. Jake found himself reading technical explanations of underground rock formations, oil migration patterns, and extraction methodologies that were far beyond his understanding as a former automotive worker. But the basic conclusion was clear. Ezra believed the land Jake had inherited was sitting on top of oil deposits worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The supporting documentation was extensive and appeared professionally prepared. Soil analysis reports from 3 different laboratories, seismic survey data that Ezra had commissioned independently, and correspondence with petroleum engineers who had reviewed his findings all pointed to the same conclusion. There was oil beneath the scrubland, potentially a lot of it. But it was the final section of Ezra's letter that made Jake's hands shake as he read it. Jake, I need you to understand that there are people who will do anything to prevent you from developing this land. 3 different oil companies have made offers to buy the property through intermediaries, always for far more than scrubland should be worth. When I refused to sell, I started receiving visits from men who weren't interested in taking no for an answer. The letter described a pattern of intimidation and pressure that had escalated over the past 5 years, as Ezra's research had become more conclusive. Phone calls at odd hours, strangers asking questions about his research around town, and even an attempted break-in at his house that had been interrupted by neighbors. I've hidden copies of all my research in 3 different locations, the letter concluded. If something happens to me, you'll need this documentation to prove your legal right to develop the mineral resources. But more importantly, you'll need allies who understand how the oil business really works, because the people who want this land have resources and connections that could make your life very difficult. Jake sat in his truck beside the stone marker, reading and rereading the letter while Mia played nearby, collecting interesting rocks and building small cairns with the patience that seemed to be her natural response to situations she didn't fully understand. The afternoon sun beat down on the scrubland with the kind of relentless heat that made everything shimmer, but Jake felt cold as he absorbed the implications of what his great-uncle had left him. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a responsibility that came with dangers he couldn't fully comprehend, and opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Jake had no experience with oil exploration, no understanding of mineral rights law, and no resources to develop anything, even if Ezra's research was completely accurate. But he also had nothing left to lose. The automotive plant wasn't coming back. Job prospects in Millbrook were essentially non-existent, and his savings would be gone within a month. If there was even a chance that Ezra Whitman's 43 years of research had uncovered something valuable, Jake had to find a way to pursue it. The first step was verifying the research with someone who understood petroleum geology. Ezra's letter included the name and contact information for Dr. Maria Santos, a petroleum engineer in Houston who had reviewed some of his findings and provided technical consultation. According to the letter, Dr. Santos was someone who could be trusted to provide honest analysis without alerting the oil companies that had been pressuring Ezra to sell. Jake called Dr. Santos that evening from his apartment after Mia had gone to bed. The conversation was awkward at first, as Jake tried to explain his situation without sounding like either a fool or a con artist. But when he mentioned Ezra Whitman's name and described some of the documents he had found, Dr. Santos' tone changed dramatically. Ezra was one of the most thorough independent researchers I ever worked with, she said. His analysis of subsurface formations was better than what I've seen from some major oil companies. If he believed there was oil on that land, I would take that very seriously. Dr. Santos agreed to review Jake's documentation and provide a professional assessment, but she also issued warnings that echoed Ezra's concerns about corporate pressure and intimidation. The oil business can be very aggressive when significant resources are at stake, she explained. If Ezra was right about the deposit size, there are people who would consider your land worth fighting for. Over the next week, Jake made several trips to the inherited property, each time discovering new evidence of Ezra's methodical research and long-term planning. Hidden in various locations around the land, he found additional boxes of documents, soil samples labeled with precise coordinates, and even a detailed survey map showing property boundaries and mineral rights ownership for the entire surrounding area. The mineral rights map was particularly revealing. It showed that while several neighboring properties had leased their mineral rights to major oil companies, Ezra had retained full ownership of both surface and mineral rights to his land. If oil was discovered, Jake would be entitled to the full value rather than the standard royalty payments that most landowners received. But Jake also discovered evidence that supported Ezra's warnings about corporate pressure. There were certified letters from 3 different oil companies offering to purchase the land for amounts that seemed far too high for scrubland with no obvious value. The offers had increased over time, suggesting that someone knew or suspected what Ezra's research had uncovered. More concerning were the incidents Ezra had documented in his final years. Strangers asking questions about his work at the local diner, phone calls from people claiming to represent various business interests, and even a formal visit from men who identified themselves as representing concerned investors who were worried about Ezra's safety living alone on remote property. Jake found himself looking over his shoulder as he drove to and from the property, wondering if the same people who had pressured his great-uncle were now watching him. The paranoia felt ridiculous until he noticed the same dark sedan parked on different streets near his apartment complex 3 days in a row. On Friday afternoon, as Jake was reviewing geological surveys in the shack, he heard the sound of vehicles approaching on the dirt road. Through the gaps in the siding, he could see 2 expensive SUVs making their way toward the house, with the kind of careful navigation that suggested the drivers were unfamiliar with the terrain. Jake quickly gathered the most important documents and stuffed them into a bag, then moved to a window where he could observe without being easily seen. The vehicles parked near the house, and 4 men in business suits got out, looking remarkably out of place in the desert landscape. The men moved with purposeful efficiency, examining the property and taking photographs with professional equipment. They weren't casual visitors or lost travelers. They were conducting some kind of survey or assessment, and they were doing it without permission on land that now belonged to Jake. One of the men appeared to be in charge, directing the others and making notes on a tablet computer. He was tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of confident posture that came from being accustomed to getting what he wanted. When he spoke to the others, his voice carried the authority of someone who was used to giving orders and having them followed. Jake watched from the shadows inside the shack as the men spent nearly an hour examining the property, paying particular attention to the concrete pads in the area around the stone marker where Jake had found Ezra's hidden documentation. They seemed to know exactly what they were looking for, which suggested they had detailed information about Ezra's research and possibly about Jake's recent visits to the property. After the men left, Jake waited another hour before emerging from the shack, making sure they weren't coming back or watching from a distance. The experience had been unsettling, but it had also confirmed that Ezra's warnings about corporate interest weren't paranoid delusions. Someone was definitely keeping track of what happened on this land. That evening, Jake called Dr. Santos to report the incident and get her assessment of the geological data he had sent her. Her analysis was both exciting and terrifying. "Jake, if your great-uncle's research is accurate, and my preliminary review suggests it might be, you're sitting on one of the largest undeveloped oil deposits in Texas. We're talking about potential reserves worth $300 to $400 million. The number was so large that Jake had trouble processing it. $400 million was more money than he could meaningfully contemplate, especially when his most pressing concern had been paying next month's rent. But Dr. Santos quickly brought him back to reality with practical considerations that were almost as overwhelming as the potential value. Developing a deposit like this requires enormous capital investment, she explained. We're talking about millions of dollars in equipment, permits, legal fees, and operational costs before you see the first dollar of revenue. You'll need partners with deep pockets and industry expertise, but you'll also need to be very careful about who you trust. Dr. Santos recommended that Jake contact a petroleum attorney who specialized in mineral rights and development partnerships. She also suggested that he begin documenting everything related to the property, including the incidents with uninvited visitors, to establish a legal record that might be important later. But most importantly, she advised Jake to be extremely cautious about discussing his situation with anyone locally. "Small towns and oil discoveries don't mix well," she warned. "Once word gets out that you might be sitting on a valuable deposit, you'll have every con artist, gold digger, and corporate shark in Texas trying to separate you from your inheritance." As Jake hung up the phone, he realized that his life had become something like a thriller movie, complete with mysterious visitors, corporate conspiracies, and stakes that were higher than anything he had ever imagined. The difference was that this was real, and the decisions he made in the coming weeks could determine whether his daughter grew up in poverty or insecurity that most people could only dream about. But first, he had to figure out how to navigate a world he didn't understand, with resources he didn't have, while protecting secrets that powerful people apparently wanted very badly. The weight of Ezra Whitman's legacy was beginning to feel heavier than Jake had anticipated, but it was also the first real hope he had felt since Rebecca's death. For better or worse, he was no longer just an unemployed single father trying to survive. He was the owner of land that might hold the key to changing everything, if he could figure out how to claim it without losing everything in the process. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who seemed uncomfortable with the formality of the situation. Jake signed for it while Mia ate cereal at their small kitchen table, completely unaware that her father's hands were shaking as he opened the envelope marked with the logo of Meridian Energy Corporation. The letter was politely worded, but unmistakably threatening. Meridian Energy, represented by their legal department in Dallas, was informing Jake that his recent activities on the inherited property had come to their attention. They expressed concern about unauthorized drilling or mineral exploration that might violate various environmental regulations and safety standards. More significantly, the letter claimed that Meridian held legitimate leasing interests in the surrounding area and suggested that Jake's property might be subject to existing agreements that predated his ownership. They requested an immediate meeting to discuss these matters and resolve any potential conflicts before legal action became necessary. Jake read the letter 3 times before he fully understood what was happening. These people were essentially claiming that his ownership of the land didn't matter because they had some kind of prior claim to the mineral rights. It was legal intimidation disguised as corporate concern, exactly the kind of pressure that Ezra's documentation had warned him to expect. But Jake was no longer the desperate man who had first visited the property 2 weeks ago. Dr. Santos had connected him with petroleum attorney David Reyes in Austin, and their initial consultation had armed Jake with enough knowledge to recognize corporate manipulation when he saw it. "Daddy, you look worried again," Mia observed with a directness that children brought to emotional situations. "Is it about the job thing?" Jake folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket, not wanting to worry her with problems she couldn't understand. "It's about some business stuff, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But privately, Jake was more than worried. He was beginning to understand that the oil industry operated according to rules he didn't know, with resources he couldn't match, and through connections he couldn't access. The phone call he had scheduled with David Reyes for that afternoon would determine whether he had any realistic chance of protecting his inheritance from people who seemed determined to claim it. David Reyes turned out to be exactly the kind of ally Jake needed. A petroleum attorney with 20 years of experience fighting major oil companies and a reputation for protecting individual landowners from corporate exploitation. More importantly, he had known and respected Ezra Whitman's work. "Your great-uncle was one of the most thorough researchers I ever encountered," David explained during their phone conversation. He understood that knowledge was power in this industry, and he spent decades accumulating the kind of documentation that makes corporate lawyers nervous. David's assessment of the Meridian Energy letter was both reassuring and alarming. The legal claims were essentially baseless, designed to create fear and uncertainty rather than to establish legitimate ownership rights. But the fact that Meridian was moving so aggressively suggested they had good reason to believe Jake's property contained something valuable. They wouldn't be spending money on legal intimidation unless they thought there was something worth fighting for, David explained. "The question is how much they know about your great-uncle's research, and how far they're willing to go to get control of your land." David recommended an immediate strategy of aggressive documentation and legal protection. Jake needed to file formal claims establishing his mineral rights ownership, obtain professional geological assessments to support his position, and create a paper trail that would make it difficult for anyone to challenge his legal standing. But all of this required money that Jake didn't have. Professional geological surveys cost thousands of dollars, legal fees were accumulating rapidly, and the $8,000 in back taxes on the property were still unpaid. Jake was facing the impossible situation of needing significant resources to protect an inheritance that might be valuable, but couldn't be developed without even more resources. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Maria Santos called Jake that evening with a proposition that could change everything if he was willing to take a calculated risk. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said, "and I have a proposal that might work for both of us. I'm part of a small investment group that specializes in independent oil exploration. We have the resources to fund proper geological surveys and development costs, but we need projects with genuine potential." Dr. Santos explained that her investment group, called Texas Independent Energy, consisted of petroleum engineers and geologists who had left major oil companies to pursue smaller, more targeted projects. They had the expertise and capital to properly evaluate and develop Jake's property, but they needed partners who owned the mineral rights rather than just leasing arrangements. The partnership structure she proposed was straightforward. Texas Independent Energy would fund all exploration and development costs in exchange for a 60% stake in any oil discovered. Jake would retain 40% ownership while having no financial risk and no operational responsibilities. "Normally, we would expect a much larger percentage," Dr. Santos explained, "but your great-uncle's research is so thorough that it significantly reduces our risk. We're essentially buying into a project that's already been scientifically validated." Jake found himself considering an opportunity that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Instead of struggling to find resources for exploration that might fail, he could partner with professionals who understood the industry and had the capital to do things properly. The 40% ownership would still represent millions of dollars if Ezra's research proved accurate. But David Reyes urged caution when Jake called to discuss the partnership offer. "Texas Independent Energy has a solid reputation," he acknowledged, "but you need to understand that once you bring in partners, you lose control over the timeline and methods. They'll make decisions based on what's best for their investment, which might not always align with what's best for your family." David recommended that Jake negotiate for specific protections, including guaranteed minimum payments, environmental safeguards, and legal provisions that would prevent the partnership from forcing him to sell his remaining stake if he needed money quickly. While Jake was navigating these complex negotiations, the corporate pressure from Meridian Energy escalated in ways that made the stakes dramatically clear. On Thursday afternoon, Jake received a phone call from Tom Morrison, the principal at Mia's elementary school, asking him to come in for an immediate meeting about his daughter's safety. The meeting was both bizarre and terrifying. Tom Morrison, who had known Jake and Mia since she started school, explained that two men in business suits had visited the school that morning, claiming to be conducting background checks for a potential employment opportunity for Jake. They asked very specific questions about Mia's schedule, who picks her up from school, and whether she ever talks about family business. Tom explained with obvious concern. "Jake, I've been an educator for 20 years, and this didn't feel like a routine employment check. These men were gathering information about your daughter, and I don't think their intentions were benign." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Somehow, his investigation of Ezra's property had escalated to the point where corporate interests were gathering intelligence about his 7-year-old daughter. The message was clear. They wanted him to understand that his family could be affected if he didn't cooperate with their demands. Jake picked Mia up from school personally that afternoon and drove directly to David Reyes's office in Austin. The attorney's assessment of the situation was grimly professional. "This is a classic intimidation escalation," David explained while Mia played with toys in the office waiting area. "They've moved from legal pressure to personal pressure, which means they're getting serious about acquiring your property. But it also means they've committed to tactics that could create legal liability if we document them properly." David immediately began filing complaints with law enforcement and petitions for restraining orders against Meridian Energy. But he also recommended that Jake expedite his partnership negotiations with Texas Independent Energy and begin development activities as quickly as possible. "The best protection you have is to establish legitimate business operations that make it difficult for anyone to interfere," David explained. "Once you have professional partners in active development, corporate harassment becomes much more legally risky for them." That evening, Jake made the phone call that would determine everything that followed. He accepted Dr. Santos's partnership offer with the additional protections that David had negotiated. formally bringing Texas Independent Energy into the project as his development partners. The legal documents were signed within 48 hours, and Dr. Santos arrived in Millbrook the following Monday with a team of geologists and surveying equipment that transformed the scrubland property into something that looked like a legitimate industrial operation. Jake watched from the shade of the mesquite trees as professional drill crews set up equipment that would either vindicate 43 years of Ezra Whitman's research or prove that his great-uncle had been chasing an elaborate delusion. The drilling process would take several days, followed by laboratory analysis that could take weeks to complete. But Dr. Santos was optimistic about the preliminary signs. The soil composition in geological formations matched Ezra's predictions with remarkable accuracy, and the drilling crew reported subsurface conditions that were consistent with significant hydrocarbon deposits. Your great-uncle knew what he was talking about, Dr. Santos told Jake as they watched the drilling operation. The formation layers are exactly what he predicted, and we're finding traces of oil at depths that match his calculations perfectly. The transformation in Jake's situation was almost surreal. 2 weeks earlier, he had been a desperate, unemployed father facing eviction and financial ruin. Now he was the partner in a professional oil exploration operation that might make him wealthy beyond anything he had ever imagined. But the corporate pressure intensified as the drilling operation became visible to anyone driving past the property. Jake began receiving multiple phone calls daily from people claiming to represent various business interests, all of them eager to discuss purchase offers or partnership opportunities that sounded too good to be true. More concerning were the visitors who appeared at the property without invitation or explanation. Twice, Jake arrived to find unfamiliar vehicles parked near the drilling operation, with occupants who claimed to be lost tourists or curious neighbors. The drilling crew, experienced with corporate espionage in the oil industry, installed security cameras and hired private security guards to monitor the site. The pressure extended to Jake's personal life in ways that made him constantly aware of potential threats. His landlord received an anonymous tip that Jake was involved in illegal activities, prompting an inspection that found nothing but created hassle and embarrassment. Mia's school received similar anonymous reports claiming that Jake was an unfit parent, resulting in a visit from Child Protective Services that was quickly resolved, but left Jake feeling violated and vulnerable. "They're trying to destabilize your life," David Reyes explained during one of their frequent phone consultations. "The goal is to create enough chaos and stress that you'll sell the property just to make the harassment stop." But Jake was no longer the broken man who had inherited Ezra's land a month earlier. The partnership with Texas Independent Energy had given him professional allies and legal protection, while the preliminary drilling results had confirmed that he was fighting for something genuinely valuable rather than chasing impossible dreams. More importantly, the harassment had revealed the true stakes of what they were dealing with. Companies didn't spend this kind of money and effort to acquire worthless scrubland. The fact that Meridian Energy was willing to engage in borderline illegal intimidation tactics proved that Ezra's research had uncovered something extraordinary. The confirmation came on a Friday afternoon in early October, when Dr. Santos called Jake with results from the laboratory analysis of core samples taken from the exploratory drilling. "Jake, you need to sit down for this," she said, and her voice carried the kind of barely controlled excitement that scientists tried to suppress when they made significant discoveries. The initial estimates were conservative. Based on the core sample analysis and seismic data, we're looking at proven reserves of approximately 42 million barrels of recoverable oil. Jake found himself unable to speak as Dr. Santos continued with calculations that transformed abstract numbers into life-changing reality. At current oil prices, 42 million barrels represented approximately $350 million in gross value. Even after extraction costs, taxes, and partnership percentages, Jake's 40% stake would be worth more than $60 million. "Jake, are you still there?" Dr. Santos asked, when the silence extended too long. "I'm here," Jake managed, looking across his small apartment toward Mia's bedroom, where she slept surrounded by stuffed animals and dreams of second-grade adventures. "I'm just trying to understand that my daughter is never going to have to worry about money." But even as the reality of his transformed situation began to sink in, Jake understood that the corporate pressure would intensify dramatically once the discovery became public knowledge. Meridian Energy and other major oil companies would escalate their efforts to acquire his property, using resources and tactics that could make his previous harassment seem mild by comparison. The next phase of his journey would require different kinds of courage and different kinds of allies. Jake Sullivan was no longer just a desperate father, trying to protect his family's inheritance. He was the owner of one of the largest oil discoveries in Texas, and that brought responsibilities and dangers he was only beginning to understand. As he tucked Mia into bed that night, reading her favorite story about magical adventures and happy endings, Jake realized that their own story was just beginning. The poor single father who had inherited a worthless shack was about to become something entirely different, and the transformation would test everything he thought he knew about himself and what he was capable of surviving. The drilling equipment hummed with purposeful efficiency in the pre-dawn darkness as Jake arrived at the property for what Dr. Santos had promised would be the most important day of the exploration process. After 2 weeks of preliminary drilling and analysis, the Texas Independent Energy team was ready to attempt their first production test, a procedure that would determine whether the oil deposit could be extracted at commercially viable rates. Jake stood beside the drilling rig with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, watching professional petroleum engineers make final adjustments to equipment he was still learning to understand. The transformation of his inherited scrubland into a legitimate industrial operation continued to feel surreal, like he was living in someone else's life. Dr. Santos approached with a tablet computer showing real-time data from sensors placed throughout the drilling apparatus. Her expression carried the focused intensity of someone who had spent 20 years in the oil industry and understood exactly what they were attempting. "Jake, I want you to understand what's about to happen," she said, pointing to various readouts on her screen. "This production test will tell us definitively whether your great-uncle's research was accurate. If oil comes up at the rates we expect, based on the core samples and pressure measurements, then we're looking at one of the most significant discoveries in Texas in the past decade." The test itself was surprisingly anticlimactic. After weeks of preparation and months of research, the actual moment of discovery involved flipping a switch and waiting to see what emerged from a pipe that disappeared into the earth beneath their feet. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The drilling equipment continued its steady operation, and the engineers monitored their instruments with professional calm that revealed nothing about their expectations or concerns. Then Jake heard Dr. Santos say something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer or an exclamation of wonder. Dark liquid began flowing from the primary extraction pipe, followed by the unmistakable sound of pressurized fluid moving through industrial equipment with considerable force. "Jake," Dr. Santos said quietly, "your great-uncle was right about everything." The oil flowed steadily for 3 hours, at rates that exceeded even the most optimistic projections from Ezra's research. The preliminary calculations suggested daily production capacity that would generate millions of dollars in revenue once full-scale extraction equipment was installed and operational. But Jake's moment of triumph was interrupted by the arrival of vehicles that had no business being on private property without permission. A convoy of black SUVs approached the drilling site with the kind of purposeful coordination that suggested military or law enforcement experience. The vehicles disgorged a dozen men in expensive suits, led by someone who carried himself with the authority of corporate leadership and the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and superior resources. "Mr. Sullivan," the leader said, approaching Jake with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Richard Blackwood, and I represent Meridian Energy Corporation. I believe it's time we had a serious conversation about your situation here." Dr. Santos positioned herself protectively between Jake and the corporate representatives, while her drilling crew continued their work with the studied professionalism of people who had dealt with corporate interference before. "This is private property," Dr. Santos said firmly, "and you're trespassing. I suggest you leave immediately, or we'll contact law enforcement." Blackwood's smile widened, but his tone carried unmistakable menace. "Dr. Santos, I'm familiar with your work and your reputation. You're a competent petroleum engineer, but you're out of your depth in this situation. The resources required to properly develop a deposit of this magnitude are far beyond what your little investment group can provide." Jake found his voice despite the intimidation tactics that were clearly designed to make him feel helpless. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm proposing a solution that benefits everyone involved," Blackwood replied, pulling out a leather portfolio containing documents that had obviously been prepared in advance. "Meridian Energy is prepared to purchase your property immediately for $25 million, cash, with closing completed within 30 days. The offer was staggering, representing more money than Jake had ever imagined possessing, but it was also a fraction of what the property was actually worth, based on the production test results they had just witnessed. Dr. Santos stepped forward before Jake could respond. Mr. Blackwood, based on preliminary production data, this property is worth at least 10 times your offer. If you're serious about negotiating, you need to come back with realistic numbers. Blackwood's expression shifted from corporate friendliness to something much colder and more threatening. Dr. Santos, I think you misunderstand the nature of this situation. Mr. Sullivan is a single father, with limited resources and no experience in petroleum development. The challenges he'll face in bringing this property to full production are considerable, and not all of them are related to engineering or geology. The threat was clear, though carefully worded to avoid explicit legal liability. Blackwood was suggesting that Jake would face problems beyond technical challenges if he refused to sell to Meridian Energy. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, the same protective fury that had sustained him through Rebecca's illness and the months of unemployment that followed. These people were threatening his family's future and trying to steal something that legally belonged to him through intimidation and implied violence. Mr. Blackwood, Jake said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice, I appreciate your offer, but I'm not interested in selling. This property has been in my family for decades, and I intend to develop it properly with partners I trust. Blackwood studied Jake for a long moment, as if reassessing his evaluation of the unemployed single father he had expected to intimidate easily. Mr. Sullivan, I hope you understand the complexity of what you're undertaking. Oil development requires significant capital investment, regulatory compliance, environmental oversight, and operational expertise that most independent operators lack. He paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. More importantly, it requires the ability to handle problems that arise during development. Equipment failures, regulatory challenges, labor disputes, safety incidents. These things happen in the oil industry, and they can be very expensive to resolve without proper resources and industry connections. Dr. Santos had been recording the conversation on her phone, understanding that they were witnessing corporate extortion disguised as business negotiation. Mr. Blackwood, are you suggesting that Mr. Sullivan will face problems that Meridian Energy could help him avoid? I'm simply pointing out the realities of petroleum development, Blackwood replied smoothly. Independent operators face challenges that major corporations are better equipped to handle. After Blackwood and his team left, Jake found himself shaking with adrenaline and anger in equal measure. The confrontation had made the stakes dramatically clear. He wasn't just dealing with business competition. He was dealing with people who were willing to use intimidation and implied threats to acquire his property. David Reyes arrived at the drilling site within 2 hours, having driven from Austin as soon as Dr. Santos called him about the corporate confrontation. His assessment of the situation was both reassuring and alarming. What you just experienced is textbook corporate extortion, David explained as they reviewed Dr. Santos's recording of the conversation. They're threatening problems that they have the power to create, then offering to solve those problems in exchange for your property. David immediately began filing complaints with federal and state agencies that oversaw oil industry practices. But he also recommended that Jake accelerate the development timeline and establish stronger legal protections against corporate interference. The best defense against this kind of pressure is to make your operation too visible and too legitimate for them to sabotage without obvious legal liability, David explained. We need media coverage, regulatory approval, and industry partnerships that make it impossible for Meridian to act against you without facing serious consequences. The media strategy worked better than anyone had expected. The story of an unemployed single father discovering oil on inherited property was exactly the kind of human interest narrative that captured public attention. Within a week, Jake found himself being interviewed by newspaper reporters and television journalists who were fascinated by the David versus Goliath aspects of his struggle against major oil corporations. The publicity brought unexpected allies and opportunities. Environmental groups offered legal support to ensure proper oversight of the drilling operation. Labor organizations expressed interest in providing workers for the extraction phase. Even political figures began paying attention to a story that embodied themes of individual determination and corporate overreach. But the media attention also intensified the corporate pressure in ways that Jake hadn't anticipated. Meridian Energy hired their own public relations firm to plant stories questioning Jake's competence and suggesting that independent oil operations posed environmental risks that major corporations were better equipped to manage. More concerning were the anonymous tips that began appearing with various regulatory agencies, claiming safety violations and environmental concerns that required immediate investigation. Each complaint was eventually dismissed as baseless, but not before causing delays and expenses that strained Jake's resources and tested his patience. The harassment extended to personal attacks that made Jake constantly aware of potential threats to his family. Someone vandalized his truck while he was at the drilling site, painting "Oil Thief" across the windshield in letters large enough to be seen from a distance. Mia's school received bomb threats that were quickly determined to be hoaxes, but which forced evacuations and created chaos that affected every family in the district. Most seriously, Jake began noticing that he was being followed by unmarked vehicles whenever he drove to or from the property. The surveillance was professional and obvious, designed to create awareness and anxiety rather than to gather information secretly. "They're trying to break you psychologically," David Reyes explained during one of their increasingly frequent consultations. "The goal is to make you associate owning this property with constant stress and danger, so that selling begins to seem like relief rather than surrender." But Jake was discovering reserves of determination and courage that he hadn't known he possessed. The harassment was frightening, but it was also proof that he was fighting for something genuinely valuable. People didn't spend this kind of time and money trying to acquire worthless property. More importantly, Jake was no longer fighting alone. Dr. Santos and her team had committed their professional reputations to the success of his project. David Reyes was treating the legal challenges as a personal mission. Even the community of Millbrook was beginning to rally around their local success story, understanding that Jake's struggle represented something larger than individual financial gain. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tom Morrison, the principal at Mia's school, approached Jake after a parent-teacher conference with information that would transform Jake's understanding of what he was really fighting against. "Jake, I need to tell you something that I probably should have mentioned weeks ago," Tom said, glancing around the school parking lot as if he were worried about being overheard. "My wife works for the county clerk's office, and she's been seeing some unusual activity related to property records in your area." Tom explained that someone had been requesting detailed information about land ownership and mineral rights for every property within a 5-mile radius of Jake's inheritance. The requests were legal and properly filed, but the volume and specificity suggested systematic research for a large-scale acquisition project. "Jake, I think Meridian Energy is planning to acquire every piece of property in your area, whether the owners want to sell or not. What they can't buy legitimately, they're going to try to force through other means." The implications were staggering. Jake wasn't just dealing with corporate pressure to acquire his specific property. He was confronting a coordinated campaign to control mineral rights across thousands of acres, with his inheritance being the key piece that would make the entire project profitable. Understanding the scope of what he was fighting against was both terrifying and empowering. Jake realized that his struggle had implications far beyond his own family's financial security. If Meridian Energy succeeded in forcing him to sell, they would have precedent and momentum to pressure every other landowner in the area. But if he could successfully resist their intimidation and develop his property independently, he would prove that individual landowners could challenge major corporations and win. The stakes had escalated far beyond personal survival. Jake Sullivan was fighting for a principle that could affect the rights of property owners throughout Texas. As he tucked Mia into bed that night, reading her favorite story about brave adventurers who overcame impossible odds, Jake realized that their own adventure was entering its most dangerous and crucial phase. The poor single father who had inherited worthless scrubland was about to discover what he was truly capable of when everything that mattered was at stake. The explosion that destroyed the drilling equipment happened at 3 in the morning on a moonless Tuesday in November, loud enough to wake half of Millbrook and bright enough to turn the night sky orange for miles around. Jake received the call from Dr. Santos while he was still in his pajamas, her voice tight with controlled fury as she described what remained of their oil extraction operation. "Jake, you need to get out here immediately," she said. "But bring David Reyes and make sure someone knows where you're going." This wasn't an accident. The drive to the property felt like traveling to a war zone. Jake could see the glow of emergency vehicle lights from 5 miles away, and the acrid smell of burning petroleum equipment filled the air long before he reached the drilling site. Fire trucks from 3 different counties were still working to contain the blaze, though the main damage had already been done. The drilling rig that had successfully extracted millions of dollars worth of oil just days earlier was now a twisted sculpture of melted metal and shattered concrete. The storage tanks that had contained their initial production were empty, their contents either burned or deliberately drained onto the ground. Most significantly, the wellhead itself had been damaged in ways that would require months of reconstruction and hundreds of thousands of dollars to repair. Dr. Santos met Jake at the perimeter established by the fire department, her face streaked with soot, and her expression carrying the kind of barely controlled anger that came from watching months of careful work destroyed in a single night. The explosives were placed with professional precision, she said, pointing to specific locations where the damage was most severe. Whoever did this understood petroleum equipment well enough to cause maximum destruction while making it look like an industrial accident. Fire Chief Martinez, who had known Jake since high school, approached with a preliminary report that confirmed everyone's suspicions. "Jake, I've been fighting industrial fires for 20 years, and this wasn't caused by equipment failure or operator error. Someone planted incendiary devices in locations calculated to destroy your operation while minimizing environmental damage." The calculated nature of the sabotage was almost as disturbing as the destruction itself. The perpetrators had been careful to avoid creating an ecological disaster that would attract federal investigation, while ensuring that Jake's operation would be completely shut down for the foreseeable future. David Reyes arrived as the sun was rising, bringing FBI agents who specialized in corporate terrorism and industrial sabotage. Special Agent Patricia Chen examined the wreckage with the methodical attention of someone who had investigated similar incidents involving conflicts between independent operators and major energy corporations. "Mr. Sullivan, what we're seeing here fits a pattern that we've been tracking across several states," Agent Chen explained as she documented the evidence. "Major energy companies have been using increasingly aggressive tactics to acquire properties with significant mineral resources, including sabotage disguised as accidents." The FBI investigation would take weeks to complete, but Agent Chen was confident that the evidence would eventually lead to criminal charges against whoever had ordered the destruction. More immediately, she arranged for federal protection for Jake and Mia, understanding that people willing to commit industrial terrorism might escalate to personal violence if their initial strategy failed. But the psychological impact of the explosion was almost as devastating as the physical damage. Jake found himself looking over his shoulder constantly, jumping at unexpected sounds and struggling to sleep despite exhaustion that seemed to penetrate his bones. The stress affected Mia as well, who began asking worried questions about why police officers were visiting their home and why they needed to change their routines for safety reasons. The financial implications were equally crushing. Insurance would eventually cover some of the equipment losses, but the delays in production meant months without revenue, while legal and reconstruction costs continued to accumulate. Jake's partnership with Texas Independent Energy was strong enough to survive the setback, but Dr. Santos warned him that their investors were growing nervous about the level of corporate resistance they were facing. "Jake, our financial backers signed up for geological risk and market volatility," Dr. Santos explained during an emergency meeting at David Reyes's law office. "They didn't expect to be dealing with industrial terrorism and federal investigations. Some of them are questioning whether this project is worth the potential liability." The pressure intensified when Richard Blackwood from Meridian Energy called Jake directly, no longer bothering with the pretense of polite business negotiation. His tone carried the authority of someone who believed he held all the advantages in a conflict that was spiraling beyond normal business competition. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm sorry to hear about the unfortunate accident at your drilling site," Blackwood said with synthetic sympathy that fooled no one. "These kinds of industrial incidents are exactly why major corporations invest so heavily in safety and security measures." Jake had learned enough about corporate manipulation to recognize the implicit threat. "Mr. Blackwood, are you suggesting that selling to Meridian Energy would prevent similar accidents?" "I'm suggesting that independent operations face risks that proper corporate resources can eliminate," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Our offer remains open, though the terms may need to be adjusted to reflect the current circumstances surrounding your property." The new offer was $40 million, substantially higher than their previous proposal, but still a fraction of the property's actual value. More significantly, Blackwood made it clear that this was a final offer, with a deadline that wouldn't be extended indefinitely. "Mr. Sullivan, my clients are prepared to be generous with someone who understands the realities of his situation," Blackwood continued. But that generosity has limits, and those limits are determined by how long this situation continues to create complications for everyone involved. Jake ended the call without responding to the offer, but the conversation left him feeling trapped between impossible choices. Accepting Meridian's proposal would solve his immediate financial problems and eliminate the danger to his family. But it would also reward the people who had tried to intimidate and terrorize him into submission. Refusing the offer meant continuing a fight against opponents with virtually unlimited resources and a demonstrated willingness to use illegal tactics to achieve their goals. The next escalation might target Jake and Mia directly rather than just their business interests. The answer came from Mia herself, in a conversation that reminded Jake why he had been fighting so hard to protect their future. She approached him that evening while he was reviewing insurance documents and legal briefs, climbing onto his lap with the kind of serious expression she usually reserved for important announcements. "Daddy, are the bad people trying to take away Uncle Ezra's present?" she asked with the directness that children brought to complex situations. Jake struggled to explain corporate intimidation and industrial sabotage in terms that a 7-year-old could understand. "Some people think that Uncle Ezra's land should belong to them instead of us, sweetheart. They're trying to make us give it to them." Mia considered this information with the thoughtful concentration she applied to challenging math problems. "But Uncle Ezra wanted us to have it, right? That's why he left it to us." "That's right, sweetheart. Then we should keep it," Mia said with the kind of moral clarity that adults often lost in the complexity of difficult situations. "Mommy always said that bullies win when good people give up." Rebecca had indeed taught their daughter that principle, and hearing it repeated in Mia's voice reminded Jake that some things were more important than safety or convenience. His daughter deserved to grow up understanding that people could fight powerful institutions and win when they had courage and proper support. The decision to continue fighting rather than accept Meridian's buyout offer transformed Jake's approach to the entire conflict. Instead of reacting defensively to corporate pressure, he began taking offensive action designed to expose Meridian's illegal tactics and build public support for independent property rights. Working with David Reyes and the FBI agents investigating the explosion, Jake helped establish a comprehensive surveillance system around the property that would make future sabotage attempts much more difficult. More importantly, they began documenting every instance of corporate harassment and intimidation, building a legal case that could result in serious criminal charges and massive financial penalties. The media strategy evolved from human interest stories about a single father's oil discovery to investigative reporting about corporate terrorism and the rights of individual property owners. Television journalists and newspaper reporters began examining Meridian Energy's business practices in other states, uncovering a pattern of aggressive acquisition tactics that had destroyed several small communities and displaced dozens of families. The publicity created political pressure that reached state and federal levels. Texas legislators began discussing stronger protections for individual mineral rights holders, while federal agencies launched investigations into energy industry practices that had previously operated without meaningful oversight. But the most significant development came when other property owners in the area began organizing to resist Meridian's acquisition campaign. Tom Morrison's information about systematic property research had been accurate. Meridian Energy was indeed attempting to control mineral rights across thousands of acres, using intimidation and pressure tactics against multiple families simultaneously. Jake found himself becoming the unofficial leader of a coalition that included ranchers, farmers, and small business owners, who were all facing similar corporate pressure. The group, which they called the Millbrook Property Rights Alliance, hired their own legal representation and began coordinating their resistance to Meridian's acquisition efforts. "Jake, what you're doing goes far beyond your own situation," explained Maria Rodriguez, a rancher whose family had been pressured to sell mineral rights they had held for 4 generations. "If we can prove that organized resistance works, it changes the balance of power between corporations and individual landowners throughout Texas." The coalition's legal strategy was coordinated by David Reyes, who understood that multiple property owners working together had far more leverage than individuals fighting separate battles. By documenting the pattern of corporate harassment across dozens of families, they could establish criminal conspiracy charges that carried serious federal penalties. The breakthrough in the FBI investigation came from an unexpected source. Agent Chen received a tip from someone inside Meridian Energy who provided detailed documentation of the company's illegal acquisition tactics, including evidence that directly linked corporate executives to the bombing of Jake's drilling equipment. Mr. Sullivan, we have recorded conversations, email correspondence, and financial records that prove Meridian Energy ordered the destruction of your operation. Agent Chen explained during a meeting that would determine the future of Jake's struggle. This evidence is sufficient to file federal terrorism charges against multiple corporate executives, including Richard Blackwood. The criminal charges were filed on a Friday afternoon in late November, accompanied by federal seizure orders that froze Meridian Energy's assets and prevented them from conducting business operations while the investigation continued. The news coverage was extensive, with television reporters describing the case as a landmark prosecution of corporate terrorism in the energy industry. But Jake's victory celebration was interrupted by news that reminded him how dangerous his opponents remained. Dr. Santos called that evening with information that changed his understanding of what they had been fighting against. Jake, the FBI seizure of Meridian's records revealed something extraordinary, she said, her voice carrying excitement and concern in equal measure. Your property isn't just valuable because of the oil deposits. It's the key to accessing a geological formation that extends across half of West Texas. Dr. Santos explained that Meridian Energy's geological surveys had identified underground oil reserves worth over $5 billion, accessible only through drilling operations based on Jake's property. The systematic acquisition campaign had been designed to control access to one of the largest untapped oil reserves in North America. Jake, you're not just fighting for your inheritance anymore, Dr. Santos continued. You're fighting for control of energy resources that could affect national oil production for decades to come. The magnitude of what Jake had stumbled into was almost incomprehensible. His struggle to protect 37 acres of scrubland had evolved into a battle over resources that could reshape the entire energy industry in Texas. The implications extended far beyond personal financial security to questions of corporate power and individual rights that would affect thousands of families. But Jake was no longer the desperate, unemployed father who had inherited Ezra's property months earlier. The months of corporate intimidation and federal investigation had transformed him into someone who understood how powerful institutions operated and how ordinary people could challenge them successfully. As he tucked Mia into bed that night, reading her favorite story about brave heroes who protected their communities from dangerous villains, Jake realized that their own story had become something larger than he had ever imagined. The poor single father who had inherited a worthless shack was about to become the center of a legal and political battle that would determine whether corporate power or individual rights would prevail in modern America. The final phase of their journey would require different kinds of courage and different kinds of strategy, but Jake was no longer fighting alone. He had allies in federal law enforcement, support from his community, and legal representation that understood how to challenge corporate power effectively. More importantly, he had discovered that ordinary people could indeed stand up to seemingly impossible odds when they had the right reasons and the proper support. Ezra Whitman's 43 years of research had been vindicated, but the real treasure he had left wasn't oil or money. It was the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds or the opposition. Jake Sullivan had inherited that legacy along with the land, and he was finally ready to claim both. The federal courthouse in Austin was packed with reporters, television cameras, and supporters when Jake arrived for the final hearing that would determine the outcome of his year-long battle against Meridian Energy Corporation. He wore the same suit he had purchased for Rebecca's funeral, now altered to fit properly and pressed to military precision by Maria Rodriguez, who had insisted that he look like the successful businessman he had become. Mia sat in the front row beside Dr. Santos and David Reyes, wearing her best dress and the kind of serious expression she usually reserved for school presentations. At 8 years old, she still didn't fully understand the legal complexities of mineral rights and corporate terrorism, but she understood that this day would determine whether her family's future would be defined by security or continued struggle. Judge William Harrison had been selected specifically for this case because of his experience with energy industry disputes and his reputation for impartiality in conflicts between individual property owners and major corporations. His preliminary statements made it clear that he understood the broader implications of the legal precedent this case would establish. Ladies and gentlemen, the issues before this court extend far beyond the specific dispute between Mr. Sullivan and Meridian Energy Corporation. Judge Harrison announced as the proceedings began. The evidence presented in this case will help determine the legal boundaries of corporate acquisition tactics and the rights of individual property owners throughout the United States. The federal prosecutor's presentation was devastating to Meridian Energy's defense. Agent Chen's investigation had uncovered recorded conversations between corporate executives discussing the bombing of Jake's drilling equipment, email correspondence authorizing illegal surveillance and harassment, and financial records showing payments to contractors who specialized in industrial sabotage. Richard Blackwood, appearing in federal custody after his arrest on terrorism charges, looked like a different person from the confident corporate executive who had threatened Jake months earlier. His expensive suit couldn't disguise the reality that he was facing decades in federal prison for crimes that had seemed like routine business tactics when he ordered them. The most damaging evidence came from Meridian's own geological surveys, which proved that the company had known about the massive oil reserves beneath Jake's property long before Ezra Whitman's death. Corporate documents showed that Meridian had been planning a systematic acquisition campaign for over 5 years, using intimidation and illegal tactics against multiple property owners to control access to billions of dollars in energy resources. But Jake's testimony was the most compelling part of the proceedings. Standing before Judge Harrison, he described his transformation from unemployed single father to reluctant oil entrepreneur, explaining how corporate intimidation had nearly broken his family before community support and federal protection allowed him to fight back successfully. "Your Honor, I never wanted to be an oil executive or a political symbol," Jake said, looking toward Mia as he spoke. "I just wanted to protect my daughter's future and honor the legacy that my great-uncle spent 43 years trying to preserve. But I learned that sometimes protecting your family means standing up to people who think their money and power make them untouchable." Judge Harrison's ruling was comprehensive and unambiguous. Meridian Energy Corporation was found guilty of federal terrorism charges, criminal conspiracy, and violation of individual property rights. The corporate executives responsible for the illegal acquisition campaign received prison sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years, while the company itself faced financial penalties that would eliminate its ability to conduct similar operations in the future. More importantly for Jake's immediate situation, the court ordered Meridian to pay restitution that covered all of his legal expenses, equipment replacement costs, and lost revenue from the bombing of his drilling operation. The financial award was substantial enough to fund his oil development independently, without requiring partnership arrangements that might compromise his control over the property. But the legal victory was only the beginning of Jake's transformation into something he had never expected to become. The publicity surrounding his successful resistance to corporate intimidation had made him a symbol of individual property rights and community resilience that attracted national attention. Within weeks of the federal court ruling, Jake was receiving invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and political gatherings throughout Texas and beyond. His story had become a powerful example of how ordinary people could challenge seemingly impossible odds when they had courage, community support, and proper legal representation. The Millbrook Property Rights Alliance had evolved into a statewide organization that provided legal assistance and political advocacy for individual landowners facing corporate pressure. Jake served as the group's spokesman, traveling across Texas to help other families protect their mineral rights and resist illegal acquisition tactics. But the most satisfying development was the completion of his oil extraction operation using equipment and techniques that honored Ezra Whitman's original research while incorporating modern safety and environmental protection standards. The production rates exceeded even Dr. Santos's most optimistic projections, generating revenue that would provide financial security for Mia's education and their family's future for generations to come. The property that had once been worthless scrubland was now the center of a carefully managed oil operation that employed dozens of local workers and contributed millions of dollars annually to the Millbrook community. Jake had insisted on hiring locally whenever possible, understanding that his success belonged to the community that had supported him during his darkest months. Tom Morrison, who had provided crucial information about Meridian's property research, became the site manager for the oil operation, applying his organizational skills and community connections to ensure that the development benefited everyone in the area. Maria Rodriguez and other members of the Property Rights Alliance served on an advisory board that helped Jake make decisions about expansion and community investment. But the real measure of Jake's transformation was visible in his relationship with Mia, who had watched her father evolve from a broken man struggling with unemployment and grief into someone who could challenge powerful institutions and protect their family's future through determination and moral courage. "Daddy, do you think Uncle Ezra knew this would happen?" Mia asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the new house Jake had built on the property, watching the sunset paint the West Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jake considered the question carefully, thinking about the decades of research and planning that Ezra Whitman had invested in protecting something he might never live to see developed. I think Uncle Ezra knew that doing the right thing was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Mia nodded with the kind of thoughtful seriousness that reminded Jake constantly of Rebecca and the values she had tried to instill in their daughter. "Mommy would have been proud of you, Daddy." As Jake tucked Mia into bed that night in their new home, reading her favorite story about heroes who protected their communities from powerful villains, he realized that their own story had become the kind of inspiration that Mia would carry forward into her own adult life. The poor single father who had inherited a worthless shack had discovered something more valuable than oil or money. He had learned that ordinary people could indeed challenge seemingly impossible odds when they fought for principles that mattered more than personal comfort or safety. Ezra Whitman's real legacy wasn't the geological research or the oil deposits he had spent 43 years trying to protect. It was the understanding that some inheritances were worth any risk to claim and any sacrifice to preserve, because they connected people to something larger than their individual struggles. Jake Sullivan had claimed that inheritance and passed it on to his daughter, along with financial security that would give her choices he had never imagined possible. But more importantly, he had shown her that courage and determination could triumph over power and intimidation when people were willing to stand together for what they believed in. The transformation was complete, but the story would continue for generations to come, carried forward by a little girl who had learned that her father could protect their family's future by fighting for principles that mattered more than money or convenience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.